Governor of Kentucky first to push back against tariffs that'll harm both of our countries, but specifically my people, but also to message to the Canadian people that this is not who we are. This might be the approach of one president, but we're much bigger than a president in this country.
I think tariffs, when you're a free market commodity state like North Dakota, we like good trade agreements, but we also want to reset it and make sure the United States is being treated fairly. The White House wants to reset the deck and wants to bring manufacturing back home, and I think that's a fantastic idea.
A duo of U.S. governors there is showing just how clearly the U.S. tariff issue splits along party lines. Now, March 4th is the date that 25% tariffs could be applied on Canadian goods going into the United States. Canadian Energy would also see 10% tariffs applied on that same day. Now, politicians from this country continue to make the case for an exemption. Many have made the trip south, hoping to convince American lawmakers to lobby for a Canadian carve-out. Yukon Premier Ranj Pillai is one of those premiers. He's also the chair of the Northern Premiers Forum, and he joins us right now. Welcome back to Power Play, Premier.
Great to see you, and thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming back. Now, the Arctic seems to be at the heart of discussions recently, and I want to get to that in just a moment. First, though, I wanted to get your reaction to the comments that you heard from those governors off the top of the show and how they feel about tariffs on Canadian goods.
Look, yeah, that's the messages that we heard when we were there as premiers. I think you're seeing Democratic lawmakers with much more comfort in coming out and talking about how important the trade relationship is and how damaging tariffs would be. My sense from speaking with senators and congresspeople that are within the Republican Party, there's still a lot of concern about repercussions if they're not following in line with the current administration. So they're a bit more cautious, as you saw in that discussion, a bit if the comments were, we have to reset the relationship, but they know, and especially in that state, how damaging tariffs would be. So pretty consistent, but incredibly important that we keep having those discussions in Washington. I know that Premier Ford, Premier Houston are there, my colleagues who I admire greatly. And, we're going to keep having those discussions right there in Americans' backyard.
Yeah, and part of that discussion is around the North. I know northern premiers have complained that there isn't the military infrastructure on our northern border to really assert Canada's sovereignty. Yesterday, that was one of the main topics of those discussions between the premiers and the Prime Minister. So I wanted to ask you, do you see the federal government really making the investments needed right now in the Arctic?
Well, look, I think that Minister Blair did a really good job in rolling out the new strategy. There's about a $73 billion commitment in North Strong and Free, and I think that's an incredible start. But we do have to occupy this space. It's long overdue. As we came into this segment, we talked about the pride that we all felt last night. Like, what an incredible night, what an incredible goal, what a game. But we need Canadians to have that same level of pride about the Arctic. I mean, the majority of landmass is here. We will see geopolitics play out here. This is Canada, and it's incredibly important that we just don't forget about what's needed in the North. And this is not just about Northerners. This is about every Canadian. This would drive the economy of our country, proper dual-use infrastructure for both military and for sustainable, healthy, resilient communities here in the North is going to have an economic impact, a positive economic impact on all our provinces, as we look to invest in a place that we have really, lacked investment for so many decades.
So then how do you feel when you saw last week that the Prime Minister was announcing this high-speed rail connection between Quebec City and Toronto as basically a nation-building project, when you consider that there are other projects that you believe need focus in the North? Do you think that Ottawa's focus is always too often in sort of those vote-rich areas and not looking at the greater good and maybe beyond what is needed in terms of votes and between election cycles when you consider where the threat could be coming from in the North?
Yeah, look, absolutely. That's a great point you're making. It takes political courage. And, moving dollars into the Arctic where really you've got 3 MPs, 1 in each territory, which at the end of the day, you know, in the spring or fall election, are probably not going to be the balance of power. But inevitably, this is one of the most important areas in this country. So yes, you're going to see these investments into voter-rich areas, but you know, we need vision as a country, and we need that vision backed up by action. And we're going to need, you know, we need ambitious, bold decision making. And if we don't have that, somebody else is going to occupy the field. And for us right now, what we're calling on Ottawa, and you know, it's a good discussion with the Prime Minister, with my colleagues, premiers across the country, which have backed the 3 northern premiers. Both Premier Simpson, Premier Aguirre have done an incredible job of amplifying the need. But this is a moment. This is truly a moment in time for Canada, and we're going to have to harness that pride that we have right now and understand that if we don't do this, we are going to be incredibly vulnerable moving forward.
And you bring up that point, and I wanted to also bring up the point that one of U.S. President Donald Trump's former advisors, Steve Bannon, also a convicted felon, by the way, he has said that the president sees the Arctic as the site of the next big power struggle, with both China and Russia eyeing our resources. How much time do you think Canada has before that threat is really at our northern shores?
Well, look, we've been sounding the alarms as northern premiers over the last number of years, and you know, the premiers that came before us, I want to commend them for their work and the focus that they have brought to the north. But we know that there's naval and maritime maneuvers happening off our coastline. This is not something new, so we are behind at this particular moment, because the infrastructure that's required when it comes to maritime infrastructure, whether it's in Nunavut, you'll hear both of my colleagues talk about Grays Bay, how important that is. In the Yukon, maybe a lot of Canadians don't, if you look at the map, there's a north coast on the Beaufort Sea in the Yukon. And since 1970, they've been talking about a potential naval port in King Point. These are things that have to be planned. The Canadian government's going to have to sit down with Indigenous leaders from across the north in the Yukon, with First Nations leaders, to define how to ensure this is done right, maximize benefits to those communities into the north. But then you're going through things like environmental assessment, you're looking at the design, and it is incredibly difficult and expensive to build in these remote regions. So we need to start now. And, now is not too late. But we have to have a sense of urgency because we are going to see over the next, 25 years, more accessibility into these maritime routes. And at the same time, if we can get to a good place with the U.S., I mean, Lubnik, I see now, has been appointed. That's going to be incredibly important, because as much as we're seeing things on X and the president speaking out, what we don't have is anybody across the table for the federal government to actually negotiate with. So now that we have a Secretary of Commerce, which will be a key individual in those discussions, we can actually sit down and talk about bargaining. This 51st state, from my perspective, is the opening salvo. This is the opening of the negotiation. Don't get distracted. I know it's frustrating and annoying to everybody in the country, but that's just the first step. What we really have to talk about is, what are things that we can put on the table that you're not going to find anywhere else? And if you're not playing appropriately with us in our trade relationship, there are tremendous markets around the world which we can solidify and do trade in those particular places. There'll be some short-term hurt for this country, absolutely. But again, it'll make us more resilient in the long run. It's not something I think that we all want to do, but that's the action that the country's going to have to take.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it on that note. Yukon Premier Ranj Pillai, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for making sure that this story is told to Canadians.